I'm your host, Angela Atkins, and today we're going to be joined by Cory Endrulat. He's a passionate abolitionist, an author, and a researcher dedicated to creating a voluntary free world. As the editor of The Liberator 2, Cory builds on the legacy of William Lloyd Garrison's original Liberator to advocate for a voluntary free society through moral education and challenging government systems. Now, Cory's work spans health, education, and a nature-based philosophy. He's a certified integrated nutrition health coach. We have that in common. And he's the author of books like Slavery Gone for Good. And he explains and explores themes about freedom, permaculture, and timeless wisdom to inspire change. He's also hosted the End of Slavery Summit, bringing together voices for liberty, and shares his nature-inspired philosophy, naturos. I knew I'd get it wrong. Natureosophy. In this episode, we're going to discuss Cory's vision for a more just and liberated world and his strategy for empowering communities. And I want to welcome you, Cory.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I'm telling you, the thing that struck me most, one was how young of a person you are, which I truly admire, just how much in depth you've gone into freedom and what it means to live a natural life. And I read your book, Government is Unnatural and Anarchy is Natural. And it really just inspired me. And I had to have you on because this is what Sovereign Sisters is about, learning about what really empowers us. So before we get started, let's go back a little bit and tell us about your journey and what inspired you to become what you call an abolitionist and define it for people, and the creator of the Liberator 2 News.
Thank you. Yes, you said I'm following the footsteps of William Lloyd Garrison, his legacy. This is a man who you may have heard in history before or may have not, but somebody who was one of the leading American abolitionist figures in the 1800s who had a newspaper called The Liberator. Now, I run a newspaper called The Liberator 2, and my journey started in health, so you and I have very similar uproots there, basically to the idea that, we need to pay attention to what's going on in our body and our environment and in the world, and it eventually led me to be concerned, or rather asking a lot of questions about the politics and the social fabric and the cultural fabric of our society, because this plays a big role on the health of individuals on a mass scale. If people are all watching the news, they're all reacting to certain laws, certain politicians in certain ways, then, there's going to be this aggregate trauma or this aggregate effect that we need to observe. How is that affecting people's minds, right? And when you start going deeper into it and you ask a lot of the moral questions and the philosophical questions and the psychological questions, as I have been doing more and more throughout my work, I find out, wow, there is a collective healing that needs to be done on the mind, not just the physical body. And so, I've dabbled into health, I've dabbled into permaculture, into growing food, and I've dabbled into philosophy and now history regarding the abolitionists, finding out that there's a bunch of people from the 1800s who were just as passionate and inspired as we are about the world and worried about the world and trying to end superstitions and false belief systems after thousands of years, such as the idea that slavery can be right or chattel slavery can be good for the economy, that's necessary and moral, right? They challenged those ideas with a higher authority, which they called the government of God, some of them religious, some of them not, some of them saying, hey, natural law and nature simply gives you this right that man cannot give you, and that is why you deserve to be free. You're not supposed to be enslaved to your fellow man. You're supposed to be, have self-ownership over yourself and your own property and have your own labor where you can produce for yourself. And they empowered the individual. They educated the slaves. They educated the mass public on the nature of slavery through their newspapers, through the printing press. And it was very inspiring to see that. They even created their own towns through the Underground Railroad. So when you look at all their actions, we're paralleling that today, creating our own towns, growing food with our neighbors or with our communities. I'm handing out sweet potatoes. I'm trying to work with people who have land in the area. I'm doing events. We're creating that parallel society, which is simply that world that we see needs to happen, needs to occur. the world that most people desire. I mean, if you ask most people, hey, would you want to be on a farm? Would you want healthy food? Do you want to have plants growing all around you where you can just grab like a fruit off a tree or an herb from the garden? You say, yeah, but oh, it's too much work. I don't know how to do it, right? All these different excuses and justifications. When we have information at our fingertips, when we have the ability to have abundance, to have freedom, we simply are keeping ourselves away from it, or we've been taught to not accept it or not have it. So my goal is to, like the abolitionists of the past, inspire people to see their own potential and their self-ownership and then to act on it.
That it almost sounds like a utopia given the way society is today. But it really, to me, it feels like this is the way God planned us to live. This is why using nature as government makes more sense, because nature is of God's design. That's perfectly aligned with what I believe. So part of what I used for this evening is your philosophy of creating a voluntary world.
Mm-hmm.
How do you envision that? Because
Yes.
that I don't think everybody understands what that actually means. What does it mean to you?
Yes, and I think the key note here is the language can throw some people off. So your philosophy, right? My idea of a voluntary world isn't my idea, right? Because the idea of a voluntary world is you don't have to agree with me and my visions of how I think the world should work. You live your own life in peace, and I live my own life in peace, and we leave each other alone and live our lives consensually every day. And we do, for the most part, already live our lives consensually, but we create an exception in politics where we say somebody should rule over everybody and certain laws should be passed. So who is really based in reality and who is not? Right? If I'm saying that everybody's already mostly following it and that there's simply some sort of contradiction that they don't see within their own belief systems, within their own actions, it's not so utopian, especially since we can see from the abolitionists, they were ending a belief system after thousands of years. Many people called them utopian. Many people gave them the same attacks and said, well, without the slaves, who will pick the cotton? Right? Well, without government, who will build the roads? These very similar excuses. Just to say, well, wait, people are just meant to be free. They're meant to have self-ownership. This is like self-evident. So why are we trying to create excuses and justifications for something that we know is true? Oh, it's utopian to reach the truth? The truth wants to be revealed. It's self-evident. It's simply all the layers of the deceptions and the lies that we have to unveil in order to see it. And we often get into those deceptions. How? Well, let's look at our formidable years. Let's look at our childhood. Let's look at the schooling systems that we have. What does it do to the child's mind? What do they train children primarily in school? What is it based off of? The Prussian model of schooling. Obedience as morality, but not necessarily encouraging the conscience of individuals. Well, if you are a slave on a plantation, you can teach the slave, say, hey, you can go to a different plantation, get a different master, make the condition better. We can train the slave to maybe like their condition more, give them some distractions, house them, clothe them so they feel more secure. But is that really empowering them to the point of saying, hey, you can be free and choose your own fate and live fully consensually, within your own life? So I don't think it's a utopian vision. Even people like Oscar Wilde and Alan Watts have said, throughout history, hey, utopia is something necessary, like that idea of wanting to make progress, because people are always focused on the past. I mean, how many people nowadays say we got to return to this founding fathers document, the Constitution, like this was 300, 200 years ago. Nobody was alive then. We don't even know who they were. Half of them were slave owners, right? So it's like, what's going on here? We're stuck in the past, but we can't be present. How are we going to make progress toward the future? We need to have some sort of goal or aim at mind. I mean, how are we going to achieve anything? I mean, you have a business or you have an organization, you have to have some sort of goal to achieve. So, I mean, it's important that as a society, we have goals that we want to achieve. And for some, that's going to Mars or merging ourselves with robotics, but it doesn't have to be that. To me, that sounds utopian. But instead, I'm just saying we have to return to nature, simply be ourselves, be authentic. And is that really that utopian, to simply say, hey, live your own life and be yourself. Don't presume the identity of authority or presume the identity of a policeman who says, I have to defend rights because I have this badge and uniform on. No, everybody can defend each other's rights. They don't need to be an authority figure. They don't need to be an order follower or a policeman in order to help their fellow man. right? So once we dispel that superstition of having a certain identity in place where now it takes away our own humanity, we start to see more of a real world, because we're living in a world where it can seem like there's a lot of fakery. I put out a video recently that says you live in a world of NPCs, and it's a compilation of clips from the media where they all repeat the same thing. It's like a robotic army. And then you look at those pictures of like World War II and the armies, and they're all file in line, right? All in the same movements. They all look the same uniforms and everything. And the only person that looks different from them is that ruler that they put in that throne with the perfect feng shui behind them, with like, the high chairs and the solid walls and the symbolism and all this stuff, the crown and the uniform and the big red carpet, to make them look as like a loyal deity, right? With the sun behind them and all sorts of symbolism that is used to trick people psychologically into worship, essentially. And even Carl Jung talked about this. He called it state slavery. So I'm clearly not the only one who's talked about it. I mean, here you have somebody who's considered a leading psychologist talking about it. And yet, where are the psychologists today talking about it? Where are the historians talking about these abolitionists who created their own towns, who rebelled and even made their own towns away from the government, like Josiah Warren, who had a town, Modern Times, for 17 years that virtually had no crime? Utopian, but it worked. It's like, what's going on here? So once you start questioning just your own reality, if it's very different from the current reality, it's going to seem like utopia, and it's going to seem like it's impossible to achieve, because there's so many people who don't see it, who don't understand it. But the more people who come to understand it and see it, the more we say, it's possible. And then when you can see, like I have gone to Jim Gale's operation here in Florida, 50 acres of open land where it's like you got all this grazing animals and cattle and like all this food forest and off-grid Airbnbs and 3D printed buildings, you're like, this sounds utopian. No, it's not. It's right here in reality. I can experience it. I'm living it. And he's not asking for permission to build buildings on his property. He's not getting permits, and he invites them to his property. He's right next to a sheriff's office. He's friends with them. He's serving the community. He's helping people. He's not harming anyone. It's incredible, right? We just have to be the example, show the change in action, and then a ripple effect can occur. And that's what's happening. Jim Gale's meeting so many people. He has like this runway where world leaders can come in and fly in, and he's already met with so many different influential figures. And that's why, we wrote a book together, and we're working on a lot of outreach material, because we can get these ideas out there on a mass scale, all these ideas that aren't taught to us in school, perhaps purposefully. Then we can see an empowerment occur, a conscious shift, an awakening, not a revolution, but an awakening, right, of the moral conscience.
So I'm putting your website on the screen so everybody can see it and follow you. You've said a lot of really great things, but the one thing that struck me is when you were talking about this, yes, we all should share in this. And I use the word utopia because it was more, it's not where we are, so it's something to long for. But one thing of having a world like that, doesn't it require a moral character of everyone to have, a good moral character in order to live this kind of life? Because that's, in my mind, some reasons why governments were made, in order to address those who didn't have good moral character and did things against the citizens that lived in the area.
That right there is the justification used by governments to control people through the centuries. Because government is not order. It often, as we see throughout history, is the source of chaos. Now, you have to break it down to a lot of different details to understand what I mean by this, because obviously there's going to be the immediate reaction for most people is, yes, people are bad. We need to have some sort of law enforcement, and I agree. There's definitely a lot of bad people out there, and there definitely needs to be some enforcement agencies. But it's how we go about in treating these problems that can sometimes be worse than the problems themselves, right? We see this in medicine where we give certain drugs to treat certain problems, and then we end up having to create more drugs to treat the problems that the other drugs created. And then we end up keep creating more and more and more drugs. So we do the same thing with laws, where we're creating one law because of the problem of another law, and then we end up compounding these problems where we never know where we are at the end of the day. And then we have so many laws and so many things, nobody's even read it or written it. It's like, what do we do? right? It's like it starts to get really confusing, and that's how we end up with tyranny, because we have this state of mass confusion where people are scrambling for answers and they're trying to latch on to anything to change that system. But at a certain point, you might just have to say, what if we abolish it? What if we create a whole, revolution? In many cases, that happens in history where all the civilizations collapse, and then everybody says, well, what do we got to do? And they create a new form of government, right? So what is the foundation of government? Is this belief in authority, the belief that somebody has the right to rule. When you understand this belief system, you start getting to the roots of what all these governments throughout history have been. It is creating a right that does not exist in nature, because where does that right come from? And it is not people voluntarily following somebody. It's somebody saying you have the right to do violence to others, but nobody else has that right. You have that right because you're an authority figure. And this can seem rather strange to some folks. I understand. I've read, Rousseau. I've looked at like these ideas of the social contract. Just by being in a society, just by being on this land, you consent, different ideas like that. But is that true consent? Just because you're here on this land that somebody arbitrarily claimed that you live on? Is that real property either? Is that property where it's like, yeah, I own this because I worked on it? No, it's like you're born into this world. Oh my gosh, I have to sign a birth certificate. Oh my gosh, I'm a citizen. It's like you didn't really have a choice in the matter, did you? And, funny enough, the children of slaves become automatic slaves. When I'm talking about slavery and connecting it to government, that too is a controversial sentiment. But if you go back to the foundations of government, Sumeria, you see this as being a trend in Babylonia and all the different kingdoms. Pretty much every single government has been a systemic system of slavery. And I've given many, many quotes in my Slavery Gone for Good book, including from Rousseau, where they admit and they say, government has been based on war, on conquest, on pillage, because otherwise they would not exist. In order to create a government, in order to create slaves, you have to go to war with someone, capture them, and so either you put them to death or you make some of them slaves. And it's more valuable to make them slaves because then they can work for you rather than put them to death. So that's how these states were originally formed by a lot of these great writers. They say it themselves. It's not just me, and a lot of the abolitionists. They tend to be in history the first anarchists. Perhaps, is that coincidental? The first, and also the leading pro-slavery advocates like George Fitzhugh said all government is slavery, and that's why we need slavery. They actually were arguing for slavery because they said government is slavery and government is tied to our nature, and that liberty is actually a false ideal, that we can never have liberty. It's just an illusion, a fantasy. And he was attacking people like Thomas Jefferson. This was a leading pro-slavery advocate. So isn't it interesting that I can go back in history and find out the roots to government or the roots to slavery, and that the pro-slavery advocates are the most pro-government, and that the anti-slavery advocates are the anarchists? I don't know a single historian out there who's come to these conclusions, but I've detailed tons of it in my book. Now, to be fair, I was inspired by one historian. His name was Lewis Perry, where he wrote a book called Radical Abolitionism, the Anarchy in the Government of God, and Anti-Slavery Thought. And that did start me on this trail of looking at, there's all these abolitionists who understand this in a much deeper sense. But once you go deeper, it's like, whoa, wow, history is just repeating itself, and people can't get themselves out of this loop. So we're playing this game where Leo Tolstoy even said this. He called his book The Slaver of Our Times, basically the closest thing to my book, Slavery Gone for Good, where he says that throughout the ages, the masters, which, by the way, most of them tend to keep their bloodlines, they tend to keep their descendants in power, have changed the wording. They've made euphemisms for control and power. So, for instance, we call ourselves citizens, but it's related to the word subject, and the word subject is related to the word subjugation, or slave, and serf, and serfdom, and slavery. I mean, these are different words representing similar concepts that the further you go back, you're like, wait, they're just changing the language. I mean, kingdom, instead it's a monarchy, or it's a republic, or it's a democracy, and we have all these different forms of still the idea that somebody has the right to rule over you, that somebody is this authority figure that should be worshipped and obeyed, and that they are basically above your conscience. Now, if you say that your conscience is more important than the law, are you willing to break the law? right? And this is like one of the questions that I propose in my videos. I have like a 5-question thing. You can maybe pull it up if you'd like, that I share in a lot of my videos to get people thinking about this. Because when I sat down about it, I was like, what's going on here? I never questioned the morality of politics. And I think for most people, they don't do that. And they just assume it's human nature to have these coercive authoritarian systems. No, it's human nature for people to come together. It's human nature for us to work together and create all sorts of organizations and businesses. But it's not human nature to presume that some one person or few people has the right to rule and can do violence to everybody, and that everybody else needs to be indoctrinated and to be slaves or needs to be citizens and sign a birth certificate and a whole bunch of legalese and rituals as part of it. That is something we're trained into, and through tradition we just come to accept, and because everybody else does it, right? We break down that psychology in over a 24-hour seminar called Health Revealed. So, I'm doing these projects because not many people are doing it, but the information is there. And so you don't have to agree with me. But if you don't have to agree with me, that's kind of the whole point of what I'm saying, right? It's like, you don't have to agree with me. I don't have to agree with you. I want to live in a voluntary world. It kind of reinforces the point I'm trying to make if you don't want to agree with me. So that's fine. It's the idea that, there's tons of people in power. They have great ideas, perhaps, of how we change the world and how we can transform this and that. But many people, like myself, will disagree and do not want to be involved. So do you want me to be coerced against my will? Do you want me to be violated upon? And I'll ask people, people who are taxation, saying, well, we need to pay this amount of money because of this road. And I'm like, yeah, but would you want violence done unto me if I didn't want that? Like, do you want that done to me? Like, would you do it yourself? No, you have to hire someone else to do it. That's even worse. It's like you got to pass the responsibility to someone else. But then even still, they still want violence done to me, and they don't call it violence. They say it's law and order, and they call me, or they'll call it a criminal or whatever. And I've never done anything criminal. I've never done anything violent. And I've been a very peaceful person. All my life, I've been very obedient to the systems. And I've been very moral. That's why I came to this conclusion, because I found out my morality came into contradiction with the belief system, with statism, because I was taught two things at once growing up. It's like, be a good person, follow the golden rule, and be yourself, and then, follow a certain political party, wear a certain ideology, and obey authority figures, and, do what they say. So it's like, these two completely contradict one another. Which one am I supposed to do? You say, well, the authority figure is supposed to represent morality. Well, then morality makes them above. Morality is above them, the authority figure. And so it's like, when you start breaking it down, it's like, wow, maybe I am having a moral contradiction in my own head, and this is where the problem lives. Not elsewhere, not in the laws, not with the politicians, not with the systems. We are the ones who create the system, right? We say, we the people, for the people, by the people. So it's us. We have to change ourselves. That's a health revolution right there.
That is a lot to digest, but
Yes.
what you have really done is really highlighted the dichotomy that we live in.
Yes.
I mean, be authentic over here, yet follow the rules over here. And they don't always jive, because the rules over here, like you said, are based on violence, because if you don't follow these rules, something bad's going to happen to you. I mean, it could be loss of liberty, it could be even loss of life. So those two things are really kind of antithetical, that you can't wrap your head around how to be authentic. But I did want to jump back for a second. You used the word anarchy, and I want to make sure people understand, because I love the simple definition. Most people think of anarchy as chaos, and you just simply say it is without rulers.
Yes,
so
from Greek.
Define that a little bit, how anarchy is kind of morphed what it truly is. It is not a chaotic lifestyle or a system without any guidance. It really is guided by nature, correct?
Yes. Yeah, and again, I said the abolitionists were like some of the first anarchists throughout history that we can call, but some of them didn't even call themselves anarchists. Historians called them anarchists. And so I find that funny, because in line with principle, in action, they technically are anarchists, but not, even though they don't call themselves that. And again, I don't want to get wrapped on the ideology or the identity, right? Because that's part of the problem. But this idea is simply a philosophical concept of no rulers. Most people assume it's no rules. So if you break it down from Greek, anarchon means no rulers. So the same way you would say monarchy would be one ruler, right? So there's a kingdom and queen, and there's the king, and you have to worship the king. So to say you're a sovereign means super regnum, which is above ruler. So that is, I'm above the rulership of another person. And notice in many kingdoms and queens, they call themselves the sovereign over the people, right? So they don't have to be ruled, but they rule everybody else below them. And so if you break down those words, you can do it like that. Although some people might say, oh, well, anarchy means chaos, and they'll find other definitions. That's fine, right? I want to get down to the bare bones of what is it actually doing? What does it actually mean? People may just use it in a revolutionary context, right? Like, oh, this person's a rebel, so they're an anarchist, or oh, this person is a communist or a socialist. Those words have gotten mixed up into anarchy too throughout history. And the reason why is because after the Civil War, you had a lot of people who were looking for employment, essentially, since the slaves didn't have to work for somebody without getting any money. Now the capitalists, or the people who had the land and were looking to hire, they had to find ways of perhaps retaining their money without losing it too quickly, or there was a lot of problems that happened after like the Civil War. Basically, they introduced taxation. You saw the rise of communism and socialism because there were worries of the economy and so many other things, because people are like, oh my gosh, we don't have slavery, and the slaves were like, don't know what freedom is, and so it's kind of a shock. And there was reimbursement the government had to give the slave owners, so it's not entirely a moral effort. And then that caused problems. The abolitionists were speaking about those problems too. They weren't just talking about the end of slavery. They were worried about these other forms of slavery. They called it economic slavery, political slavery, medical slavery, technological slavery, and
And
even
isn't that still
military.
happening today?
Yeah, yes, and military slavery. All those I would say are happening today, and even chattel slavery still happens in some parts of the world. But in the aggregate, we recognize it's wrong. So we've made some progress, right? And then there were the civil rights movement later on, as people realized they were still being discriminated upon, even though there was no slavery. There was separation of bathrooms. There were all sorts of things that were happening. So there was still progress to be made, and there still is progress to be made now. I mean, we just recognized that other races are equal to other races, like not even 100 years ago. So now we have to recognize we're all just human beings. We're all just people, and no one person has like this divine right to rule, which came originally from this idea of priest kings in Sumeria, which is that God gave me this right and I am bestowed with that right, and therefore, and all that fancy legalese. But going back to the point, so anarchy can be seen through those multiple different lenses, right? And I think it's fine, even if you see it as chaos. That's why I usually use the word voluntarism, because it gets more specific. It says, hey, I want a voluntary free world, and it's based on consent. It's a rule. That's a rule right there. When you say somebody has self-ownership and that people should act voluntarily, and that, or by the non-aggression principle, or by natural law, or by the golden rule, whatever you want to use as your moral code, you can think whatever you want of your moral code. If you're not imposing it on others, telling them what the moral code is, you're essentially following the golden rule. You're essentially following voluntarism. So you don't even have to agree on the definition of morality. And that's part of the problem, by the way. It's like, as human species, we can't agree on everything. Like, we all have opinions of our own. We all have different ways of living our own lives. None of us can agree fully on something. I mean, this is why people debate endlessly about politics and ideology and economy, and even some of the most basic things like food and music. It's like nobody really has the same values on anything. So people are trying to project often their fears, their insecurities on others. And we often find that's a trait too within psychopaths and sociopaths, which, by the way, there's like the highest concentration of psychopaths in the nation in Washington, D.C. But anyways, regardless of that, who seeks
Great
power?
point.
The average
Great point.
person doesn't seek power. They don't want to rule over their fellow men. They just want to live their own life. So the problem is you have all these masses of people, millions of people following like one or few people. And then we're like, how come we can't leave this system if we have millions of people and there's only so few of them? It's because they're wrapped in this mindset that gets them so disillusioned from reality and from their true authority, which is nature. And nature is not based on opinion, it's based on reality. There's laws that you have to follow. You jump off a cliff, you're going to get hurt. There's, there's thermodynamics, inertia, gravity, and density, and all this stuff. Like, these are laws, these are quantifiable, they're mathematical, and they apply everywhere at all times. And so nobody's going to be changing them. No opinion can just suddenly change these laws. But with government, it's all based on opinion. So it's like, of course people are going to disagree. Of course it's never going to last. Of course it's going to result in violence, especially if it's just going to continue to grow, because people are going to say, well, what about this and what about that? And I need my needs fulfilled. I need my needs fulfilled. And, oh, this person's in charge. Now this person's in charge. And it's like, it's a very arbitrary system. So you're going to get arbitrary results, which means confusion, which means people not knowing each other. Like, I have some person who rules over me millions of miles away. I don't even know. It's like, what's going on? And now we live in an increasingly technological and social world where the world is more interconnected. So some people fear of this idea of a world government. And you look at like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell and their predictions of the future, and notice what they say within their writings, that the rulers will find ways to make it seem like as if they're not ruling the people, and that people will enslave themselves. That is mental slavery, the root cause to all forms of slavery that I deduce in my work. So if you understand mental slavery, it's the same thing as statism, believing that somebody else should rule over you and that you're meant to be a subject or a slave or a citizen, that you're meant to not be your highest potential, not to be your authentic self. You're pushing yourself down without even realizing it because you've been trained into doing it. Isn't that isn't that crazy? I mean, that's what these writers are predicting, essentially, even in their writings. And if you go through it, people are like, oh my gosh, we're going to create Orwell's 1984, but they don't understand the belief system that gets us there. If you shatter away that belief system and you put the authority in God and nature and truth where it belongs, which is where most people they just overthrow with this other belief system, through politics and through the ritual and the theater and the sports games of whose side do I play and what color do I play. This really takes over people's conscience. It convinces them not to follow their heart, not to follow principles. And some people don't even know what those principles are, which is why people like Mark Passio are teaching others, hey, this is what natural law is, and this is how you define morality, because people don't even have a moral compass for themselves. And then some people think it's all completely relative and we could just do whatever we want and we're beasts and it's might makes right. Well, that's the same mentality that the slave owners had originally back a couple thousand years ago, is that if we just capture these guys and make them slaves, it's justified. But as we evolved, we realized we don't have to be that, and we have the printing press and mass education and philosophy. This is designed. These very systems are created. Education exists for the very purpose of creating a more enlightened species. What's the point of education if we have to make people good through law? It's the same thing that the Taoists talked about in ancient China, who were considered the first anarchists in history. They were a bunch of sages and masters who were practicing martial arts, who were doing Tai Chi and Feng Shui and all the stuff from ancient China. And they were at odds with the Confucians, who said, well, we need to make people good through laws because people are not inherently good. And the Taoists said, wait, people are inherently good if you just like kind of let them be. They're not even necessarily inherently good. They're just people. Like, they're going to do bad things. That's fine. But if you react in a way where you aggregate and you make that wrong thing, that wrongdoing grow, then it's going to become a problem. So law is doing that. It's aggregating the wrongdoing and making the wrongdoing expand, even though it's claiming to prevent it. Now, why is that? Because authority, again, creates an exception in morality. It says it's right to do wrong. And if you're saying it's right to do it, then that means it's going to grow and grow and grow. And so if you have a limited government, it's the same concept. It's limited violence, limited slavery, but it's still violence and slavery being basically permitted and allowed. And so as long as it's permitted and allowed, it's going to grow and grow and grow, and it's never going to stop until another collapse happens. And if people still have that mindset of, oh, some violence is legitimate, it's going to come back again, right? And so religion has been very powerful as a tool for governments as well, because if religion can convince people that it's their moral duty to go to war to somebody else who believes different from them, then now it's again saying that it's right to do wrong. And so they're creating an exception in the golden rule, which is their own teaching. And they're going to war with their fellow man. because their ideology is keeping them so controlled and so, what Yuri Bezmenov calls ideological subversion. They basically go through this demoralization and idealization that turns them into somebody that's no longer human. And then you wonder why politicians become corrupt and why the people have become fake. It's because as above, so below. These are the mindsets we're permitting into the world, and the foods that we're creating, and all the other things are just a reflection of what we're thinking.
Yeah, it all comes center that you have to be responsible for yourself. And that includes not just doing the right thing, but eating the right thing, drinking the right things, keeping your body purified, basically,
Yes.
because that's really what we need to do to get rid of everything toxic from our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you are toxic free, you actually are a better person. You're
Yes.
physically better, you're mentally better, it clears up your brain, you can critically think, you can make decisions much more rationally with a keen eye rather than just things imposed upon you. And this is a lot, I think, for people to take in.
Yes.
So I can see that you must have faced a lot of challenges trying to get this information out. When you're trying to promote your ideas and you're challenged by them, how do you overcome those challenges?
The key idea is to ask questions, and that's why I share those 5 questions in my videos. And I try to keep the videos rather concise and to the point. And I share different things in different videos, but I don't just throw it out all at once. It depends. Like, so for instance, I have a video on the psychology experiments, like the Stanley Milgram experiment, the Stanford Prison experiment, which detail exactly the mindset that I'm talking about as well. And these are banned, psychological, unethical experiments. Scientists are confused. They don't know how it happened. And, it's like, no wonder once you start looking down the road of statism and these ideas that the psychologists are unaware of, the scientists are unaware of, you start realizing, wait, this is the problem. And I actually gathered a whole compilation of all the different Stanley Milgram experiments done on my channel. It's like an hour-long video where at the end it talks about how it's not human nature because there were people in the experiment who did deny to go along with the orders of the authority figure because they understood history. They knew also that not to suppress their conscience. So although the overwhelming majority did suppress their conscience, everyday average people suppress their conscience willing to hurt their fellow man. That's what these experiments proved. Everyday people doing that. There were a few people who said their reason when they talked about it was, yeah, because I know it's wrong and I'm not going to put up with it. If I see someone saying not to stop it, I'm going to stop it. I'm not going to, obey the authority figure and not listen to this person who's clearly crying out in pain. This person who's telling me to stop, like, I'm going to listen to them. But there are people who continued the experiment despite the fact that there was this person crying out in pain saying to stop the experiment, saying we got to end it right now. That authority superstition overruled their whole emotional complex. And so you see this in health, many people, oh, I'm doing my job, and they're harming many people and doing all sorts of experiments that are unethical. And by the way, it's not a surprise that it's considered unethical for any experiment nowadays to be done without consent. So if we apply that everywhere in society, we'd be pretty good, wouldn't we? Because every law is basically an experiment. It's somebody has a thesis of this is how the world will work if we pass this law, just like a psychology experiment. And they do it instead through the lack of consent. So it's a mass psychology experiment. But
Yeah, I
psychologists don't think
totally
about that.
agree that although we are supposed to be given informed consent on many things,
Mm-hmm.
most people are willing to give up their freedom for security.
Yes.
If you do this, we will protect you, which really doesn't happen anyway, we being the government or the
Mm-hmm.
authority. And all they're doing is getting you to be slaves, like you said, but it's through fear, through coercion, and sometimes through violence. So in today's world, there are many people who feel powerless
Yes.
because we have been oppressed by governments. We have been taken down, whittled away at our confidence, at our autonomy. I mean, there are people who have no bodily autonomy anymore because they've given it up to government.
Mm-hmm.
So what advice would you give them if they're feeling powerless? How do they regain that confidence? How do they step into their autonomy?
Yes, and we can propose many solutions, such as health solutions, such as growing food. And some people may do it, some people may not, and it's not necessarily a requirement to have to do all those things, right? A lot of these things can help people. They may even spark all the other changes that I talked about, like the moral, intellectual development. But I think one of the most effective strategies is the Socratic questioning that I mentioned before, to help others if we're talking to others. But we do have to help ourselves first and foremost. This is the home we live in, right? This is what we have to take responsibility of. This is self-ownership. So we have to know thyself. This is what I consider the most important, philosophical teaching as well. Well, not a coincidence. When you know yourself, you're in further control of yourself. So, do we love ourselves? Can we truly come from that position of love to ourselves so we can give it to others? Because unless we have self-respect here, we're not going to give self-respect out there, right? So this is just something to bear in mind, because I said it's a reflection. A lot of people are projecting. A lot of people are looking for ideology, usually because they lack a mother figure or a father figure. There's a masculine or imbalance, feminine imbalance in their life. There's different things going on that's leading people to certain forms of these ideologies in different ways of thinking. So when you start to think like that, it's like evaluate your own life, do some self-reflection, do some journaling, and ask yourself the questions and your own questions and start getting really curious. And are you willing to, for a moment, drop your ideologies? Just for a moment, drop everything that you've been trained and thought about yourself or about the world, just for a moment, and see what happens and see what appears for you. This is what the Taoists call the uncarved block, returning to our most natural state, which is like that innocent child who's just growing up in the world, not being programmed or conditioned to think in any particular way. If you say truth or nature or God is your true source of authority, then sit with it directly. Be able to decompress and decondition from everything else that has been brought to you. And if you can do that and you can see your authority as nature, God, or truth, or whatever else you want to describe it as, that right there is going to be infinitely more powerful than any other authority. And that's going to lead you, I would say, to all the other solutions and answers. I don't have to name them, right? Because there's certainly things I'm going to miss out on if I start naming them. And there's certainly things that are going to shift through the ages that are going to be beyond my time that we're still trying to understand from nature. Like, I'm just one stepping stone on the evolution of humanity, but I'm certainly not the end of it. And nor am I at the beginning of it. I'm just part of the continuum. So, we're all part of that continuum. We're all part of the different puzzle. We all have something to share. We all have something unique in this life. And we have to tap into that. That's our potential. That's our value. And part of self-ownership is recognizing your own value. Recognizing your uniqueness for your own being. That becomes devalued when you're said to be just an order follower like everybody else. Just be this person who's conforming along with everyone else. You're not yourself. So the more you tap into this concept of like I am the self, that without the identity, without all these different ideologies, you naturally become an anarchist. It's not even a question. And it's without having to even use the term. Like Osho talked about, like in the 1900s, talked about, look up his spiritual wisdom and his teachings, and he talked about how Zen and a lot of the Buddhist practices are basically anarchic in nature, because they don't even talk about politics. They keep it out because it's not really, it kind of is a distraction. He says it's based in ego. It's based in projection. And when you see that, and then you parallel that with Carl Jung and Abraham Maslow, who talked about the hierarchy of needs, even Herbert Spencer, who coined the term survival of the fittest, for all the people saying, oh, it's going to be the law of the jungle. I mean, he was an anarchist too. So why would the guy coining the term survival of the fittest also be an anarchist, unless he just straight up wants chaos for the world? But he doesn't. He was a polymath. He excelled in so many different fields, and people respected him for his wisdom in the 1800s. He did so many amazing things. This guy was a biologist and looking at so many crazy subjects that would just blow your mind away. And so he studied in anthropology. You have some of the leaders right now. One of the top linguists in the country, Noam Chomsky, he's an anarchist. You got like I said, Jung, Carl Jung, he's like one of the top psychologists. Tolkien, one of the top fantasy writers, he was an anarchist. People don't know this stuff. But some of the most intelligent folks tend to be very independent thinking. And whether they called themselves an anarchist or not didn't really matter, because if they thought for themselves, they technically were. You see what I mean? It's like you start looking at their political worldviews and they don't have one because they're just thinking for themselves. That's an anarchist. You know, most people do not vote. Over 50% of people in America don't vote every election, even that, despite all the vote, vote, vote constantly all over the media, all over our signs, which are polluting all our grasses and our lawns and everything. You know, it's like, gosh, how much they throw it in our faces to vote, and still people don't vote because they just want to live their lives. So you have that half of the population not consenting, and then another half of the people who do vote who don't get what they want. And so it's like you barely get the world that people actually desire in this world. And then those people who get that person in office are just in blind faith that that person will do what they want. And they have to go through a bunch of other loops and a bunch of other things as well. So definitely need a decentralization, and it's not going to happen within the political realm. It's going to happen through people through their actions, creating that change directly. That's what gets people inspired and motivated. That's what creates an actual, like, systematic revolution in history. And some of the most impactful have been nonviolent resistances. So this is another strategy people can use, right? Look at the efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. Look at the Quakers and look at the abolitionists. They all had this trend of keep things as peaceful as possible and simply educate people, and then do it on a mass scale, even if that means walking through a street or walking from one end of the country to the other. Just by being there, just by being present, showing that you're with others, that can do a great deal of wonders. But do so completely peacefully. You know, make that clear.
That is so true. Most people think in order to have change, it's got to be dramatic and it's
Yes.
got to be in your face. When it really starts with being centered in your heart. One thing that occurred to me while you were talking is, in order to take these steps, I think it really needs to begin with parents who are raising children to be themselves, not to follow some structure. And yeah, maybe homeschooling is the way to go, because most of our educational systems are government run,
Mm.
or they're run by organizations that have a philosophy that doesn't really jive with voluntarism or autonomy.
Yeah.
So I think, in my mind, what I'm looking at, if I were a new parent, I would be looking at raising my child to become the most authentic version of themselves and not worry about the rest of the stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you learn life by living it, not by somebody telling you how to live it.
That's right.
So if you don't step up as a parent and start saying, this is your life and you're going to lead it the way that's right for you, they become part of the system. They, basically parents give up their children every day to, educational systems that basically teach by memorizing and rote responses, and they're not really using critical thinking skills. They're not doing anything that's promoting their own personal philosophies or living a natural life. So I think that's where it begins.
Yes.
But for people who are already past that or who don't have children, what's the first step they can take? How do they go on the road to living a truly voluntary life?
Yes, and I'm sorry if I didn't answer that, I think, as directly before, though I was speaking more on the aggregate of what people
Right.
can do when they come
I'm
together.
just trying to give people
Yes.
something actionable that they can take away. Like as with health coaching,
Hmm.
you give somebody an actionable
Right.
thing they can do, and they take it away, and they feel like, I'm empowered to do this. That's just kind of what I'm looking for in this realm.
Yes, well, I definitely, for starter steps, I mentioned journaling, and I think that's more of an individual pursuit, right? You have to self-reflect, but you might have somebody else help you, because they can sometimes see things that you don't see within yourself, in case you do feel like there's some trauma or some shadow work to do, some people will call it. You can look up shadow work. If you had a really bad experience in your past, I definitely would recommend looking into shadow work and facing your traumas, and that's something that you can talk about for quite some time as well, as a whole separate subject. subject, but grow like one plant, one perennial local native plant in your area. That would be easy to grow, like no effort. And then just show by example, because immediately if you start growing food in your environment and showing your neighbors, you're going to attract them to you. And I think that's part of the goal is you don't necessarily want to go on the rooftops and say, oh, I know all this information and you got to wake up and blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't do that, right? And I've seen from Jim Gale's operation, people are just attracted to him and what he's doing because of what he has set up. And he's videotaping it, he's making it a whole bunch of things, which are incredible. He even has Airbnbs for people to stay. So you can create, that little type of paradise in your own home that not only helps your own mood or your own health, but helps you share the word. So I definitely would recommend, starting with one plant, starting, if you're new to diet, starting with a new food in your diet, introducing more and more healthy foods as time goes on. Don't try to like change everything at once and throw everything in the garbage and get a do not do this, do not do that, do not do this. Like, don't just create a do not list, but to start adding in good foods, right? And integrating in those functions. You're into integrative nutrition, so you know that function of basically adding in the crowd out the bad. Well, if we do that in this context, let's just go along what we're passionate about. You may not be passionate about psychology or history, but you may be passionate about permaculture, or maybe it's some other thing, right? Whatever you're passionate about, I encourage you to follow it. Because whatever it is, it's going to help you achieve autonomy. If this is something that you individually seek out and feel like is important and something that you've never maybe looked into before, that you felt like, I kind of want to look into that. Like for the first time, I'm learning another language. I'm learning Chinese, right? And now I'm trying to get into like quilting and stitching, all sorts of things, because I want to learn these different arts, because these are arts that have existed for a lot of ages. And maybe one of them I really like and may do something more with in the future. I don't know. But also I can show other people and I can give them gifts. And I'm thinking about that because when you give to others, you give to yourself. Right? You want to be selfish in the pursuit of truth. As Jim Gale says. Jim Gale makes that one of his core messages. Because if you're selfish in that regards, like being greedy to want to do good, greed is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because by helping others, you should also help yourself. You wouldn't necessarily sacrifice everything you have for somebody else. That's not really helpful or healthy to do. But at the same time, you want to give to other people to also give to yourself. And that's, I think, a really important relationship. So you can apply that to all these other things in other fields as well. I hope that was more actionable for what people can do. And then when it comes to like books, of course, I could recommend The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larkin Rose is perhaps the best read on the subject of statism that I've seen. If you want videos, my psychology video is really good, but I have videos on all sorts of different topics and documentaries of different kinds, and people come from this in many different backgrounds. Some folks are spiritual, some folks are not, right? Some folks are into health, some folks are not, and that's fine. The whole idea, again, is think what you want, just don't impose it on others. You're not the authority of this life. Nature, God, truth is, right? So let's respect
Absolutely.
that.
That you have such great words of wisdom that they resonate with me 100%. And we got into talking about health, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your latest initiative. And maybe you can even come back and talk about it when you've got it underway, because it really does, again, resonate with me. Tell us about your new work.
Yeah. And by the way, as another action step, I have a network for people on the liberator.us where people can network with others in their area. I show you how you can create your own events and use different social media platforms. So there's a lot you can do if you want to bring your efforts further. But the personal work is always very important, first and foremost. And you don't necessarily have to know everything in the world and feel like, oh, I don't know enough. I don't know how, like, that's fine. Like there isn't really a requirement for you to simply be you. There isn't a requirement for you to understand freedom or have a relationship with God or nature or truth, because it's ever present. It's all around you. You simply have to be present with it, right? And that is, presence with the presence. You can say you're connecting with spirit or source that way if you're a spiritual individual. I would consider it as such, but if you don't come from that background too, that's fine. I have many friends with different backgrounds, and we all agree that we should just let people live their own lives. Live and let live is another way to say it. But sorry, go back to your question. What did you mention specifically you want me to go into?
Your latest
Yeah.
project that you're
Okay.
working on.
So Health Revealed, right, is something that has been the latest project, healthrevealed.org, and people can check it out. That goes deep into the psychology of this belief system, where we break it down from like grassroots level, like very beginning, introductions, disclaimers, bringing all the way up. What is health? What does it mean? What can practitioners do? What do they currently feel? They get burnout. So it's not just for medical practitioners, it's for their patients, but it's also for the general public. So it's a call for people like Jordan Peterson and all the psychologists out there to look at this belief system. It's a call for all those people in these academia worlds to look at what we're talking about and to take it seriously, because we're not just some like political theorists who are coming up with their own ideas of how the world should work. We're claiming that this is a reality that we have to learn to embrace and face, and that's a hardship, and that's a shadow work, and that's something that it's a collective trauma that we've been overcoming for thousands of years as a human species. So that's a pretty big claim, and me claiming government as slavery ever since its foundations, I'm willing to uphold this against academia, or at least to show the words of the philosophers of the past who have said it, not just myself. So that would be my challenge for anybody out there who's in academia. But I plan on getting involved with the colleges as well, and maybe I'll meet some academia there as well who are intrigued. But the younger generation is the future, so it's very important that they find inspiration within themselves and see their own value and meaning and purpose. There is a book by Victor, I forget his last name, but it's called The Search for Meaning. And you can look up The Search for Meaning by Victor. He basically makes the case that the reason why we have a lot of depression and anxiety and mental health problems is because this younger generation doesn't really have a sense of meaning or purpose in their lives. And they're constantly being distracted by social media that's providing all these different pleasures for them. Immediate gratification, right? All these dopamine hits, which are actually ending up creating more depression, creating more antisocial behavior, despite calling it social behavior. Again, it's a very ironic system. The doctors are creating disease, the lawyers are destroying justice. You go down the line, everything's the opposite of what it is. I would argue it's because we're not living a natural life, because all those fields can be done naturally, but in a very different way, of course, than what they're currently doing. They have to respect some higher authority beyond their job, beyond the paperwork, beyond the legalese and the identities that they presume. When the doctor says, I am the doctor, I'm here to heal you, he's not necessarily helping the patient as the doctor who says, I want to educate you and help you become your own doctor. Right? So the best leaders in history are those who say, hey, I want you to be your own leader. But then by doing so, they deduce their own status and they don't become a leader anymore. So it's so ironic, but the truth tends to work out in such ironic ways. And so conveying that to a younger audience, I know it's going to be some confusion, but I'm just going to ask questions, be there for support, be present, and that's how we can change the system radically. Just be present with one another, just by providing support, just by being authentic, just by showing the example. I think everything can shift. And then using the nonviolent resistance tactics that have been used throughout history on a mass scale would be important. So like if one town stopped paying taxes, this whole system would be over. Like really, and then you could create a domino effect, and you can document that using, video and just showing, because if some policemen were to come to that town, they would be exposing themselves. The violence exposes itself against the peaceful people who are standing their ground. I thought this country was we the people, for the people, by the people. So why are our representatives and our servants fighting us on something that we just want to do for ourselves peacefully, not harming anybody? So that would be an example on a mass scale. And any influencer can do that, by the way, within a week if they really had the courageous bravery to do it. So they're constantly complaining about tyranny and all these problems in the world, but they don't know how to confront it. They have the ability to change things within a week if they truly wanted to. They can say, hey, we're going to do this event. We're going to get together in the public. We're going to grow some trees. We're going to grow some food, whatever it is. Any of that could be very actionable for their audience and create a way bigger impact than me. Right? But I'm doing these local events in my area, and I'm trying to build up grassroots myself to show the example, and then hopefully maybe some of them can start to catch on. Right? Because I can't point the finger all day and say you got to be doing this, not necessarily. But there's people who have millions of subscribers out there who have so many followers, and my challenge to them, if you're listening, is, hey, what are you doing? Where's your action steps? I look at your comment sections and people are like, what do we do? I want to know, what's the action steps? I see it everywhere. And they're always complaining about the problems, talking endlessly about the problems, but they never introduce, like, how do we come together and actually solve it? That's a big problem. That's why we created that natural intelligence book where we detail it from every audience perspective. So we have documents for churches, prisons, and schools and different audiences. Because if you are one of these institutions or you're involved with these are the institutions that can change the world. The abolitionists used the churches, right, because they were very religious individuals, and that gave them a great benefit to their cause. But nowadays, we can similarly use these different institutions to say, hey, what if all the churches grew food around their premises? Like, there would be no disease, no hunger, and we would basically solve a lot of our problems. The economy would become much more decentralized just immediately, just from everybody replacing their lawns, which are just sitting there doing nothing, providing no assets, poisoning, everything runs off into the water. Instead of that, we can grow food, which it literally says in the Bible that, have food around your church, and we would see a radical shift, right? So that's just one example. The prisons, the recidivism rate goes down like 60, 80% just by introducing a garden and letting the inmates work on a garden. And they've had personal experiences where they're like, wow, I'm now interacting with nature. Like, I feel different. I feel alive, right? Instead of being in that cell where it's like really cold and it's like, are we really treating like humans like animals? Are we going to do that? Or are we going to treat them as if they are supposed to be something higher and more? So if we want them to be better, we have to treat them as such. And we have to rethink the way we're doing things. So I'm involved with that as well. There's Second Chance University, the biggest prison university in the world, that I'm involved with the Earth Council that Jim Gale is on, to try to get more people into permaculture, into growing food, and getting the education access to those inmates, into those prisoners. And so all this is happening. It's all happening in different ways. And I encourage anybody out there to reach out, and share their efforts. And if they want any help with content creation, that's another thing they can do. But I've been helping out a lot of people with content creation. So it's the events, it's the content creation, it's the colleges, it's the online work. We got to integrate it all together. There's a lot on me, but there's a lot that other people can do too. Just as one individual, if I can do all this, then what if we all, come together and share our piece of the puzzle?
That is the answer right there. That
Yeah.
is the answer. And we have reached our time, but I do want to say, I personally am going to go to Health Revealed and see how I can
Mhm.
participate. That is definitely something on my list. But tell everybody how they can connect with you and support your work.
The Liberator.us is a main website I run as a newspaper and a newsletter, and I'm partnering with a local business as well to also provide a local newspaper and database for any area, so you can fill in your information, like if you're a doctor, or provide certain services in certain areas. Trying to build a database worldwide now so people can network with each other. There's other websites like freedomcells.org and other places that I link on there as well, but there's a lot of resources. There's a learn page, action page, share page, so it's all there, quiz page, testimonies, so you can hear people's personal experiences. Like, I've interviewed cops with 30, 40 years in law enforcement who get out of statism and that belief system. That's really impactful. These are people who had firsthand experience. Tends to be those people who really start to wake up and say, wow, this is completely a lie. So again, it's the irony of the universe. It brings the people who are the most in it to this information. Oftentimes, I'm very fortunate I didn't have too much shadow work or any bad problems in my life that led me to this information, but a lot of people have. A lot of people have had a lot of bad experiences, people who were drug addicts or people who went through these different systems and they just got screwed over and made even worse, until they've realized, wait, I have to get beyond this completely. And I need to completely take charge of my life and my health, because these systems will never help me if I'm always dependent on them. So, Jim Gale even made a video recently, like, if you want to be a real man, follow Trump and worship him as a deity, as like a satirical piece. But what he's trying to say is, like, if you want to be a real man, don't, follow your own heart, try to be like your own self, at least think for yourself. And it's not really much of a requirement. Is it really that difficult to do? I mean, it could seem like it is in today's world. Like Carl Jung said, it's the hardest thing in the world just to be present, just to be yourself.
Mhm.
And that's simply because of all the programming and conditioning. But I thank everybody out there for listening and watching. And if you want, check out the liberator.us or nita.one for all the documents on the permaculture side of things, and then healthrevealed.org for the health psychology side of things.
Well, I'll definitely include all those links in the description of this live. And I can't thank you enough. And I hope you'll come back and discuss how your Health Revealed is going and all
Mhm.
your other initiatives, because this is what we need to hear. We need to hear people who are already there
Yes.
and not just talking about being
Right.
there. They're already there. We need to stop all the idolatry, like you said, that's really part of the culture that needs to go, and we need to set ourselves up. Like you said, we need to be selfish and start putting ourselves first, because once we're filled, we have all that we need, we can give more. And so this has been fabulous. The hour has gone by so fast. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I thank you so much for your time, your experience, and your expertise. And I look forward to hopefully working with you.
Thank you very much. As with you, please contribute.
I
Absolutely. Thank you
would
very
love
much.
to. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll put all of the links in the show notes so you'll be able to connect with Cory and hopefully join any of his projects or all of them as you feel fit. So until next time, God bless.